Have you ever wondered how a young country like the United States plunged into one of the bloodiest conflicts in history? In this video, we will unravel the secrets and strategies behind the American Civil War, an epic struggle that divided a nation and shaped the future of the United States as we know it today. If you feel you want to understand more about how small decisions can trigger major changes, or how leaders have dealt with seemingly insoluble conflicts, this video is for you.
Let's explore every detail, from political agreements to battles that have changed the course of history. Get ready to find out how the American War is not just an event of the past, but a reflection of challenges we have faced to date. The American Civil War is one of those chapters of history that captivates the mind and heart, not only for its magnitude, but for the impact it had on the formation of the United States as we know today. Imagine a youthful nation, full of potential, but divided by such deep issues that it seemed impossible to achieve consensus. This scenario, so full of nuances and contradictions, brings us to one of the greatest internal conflicts in American history. These were not just economic or political differences, but of moral and cultural principles in direct collision. The American War offers us a fascinating lesson on how war strategies intertwine with political decisions and social values. At first, apparent harmony between free and slaver states gave an illusion of stability. However, the subtext was clear. Tensions boiled below the surface. It's like building a house on a tectonic failure. Either sooner or later, the structure cannot resist. In this context, understanding the motivations and conflicts of this time is fundamental to capture the complexity of the American War. Questions about the future of slavery, the Southern economy, and the Northern expansionist aspirations reveal the depth of this clash. This story is more than numbers and dates. It is a mosaic of actions, choices, and consequences. Each political decision was a piece on the war strategy chessboard. Missouri's commitment, for example, can be seen as a defensive movement to slow the inevitable confrontation. Have you ever wondered how can accumulate tensions explode like a barrel of gunpowder? It is this sense of anticipation that permeates the events that led to the American Civil War. While we dive into events, it is crucial to remember that they are like interconnected chapters of a larger narrative. Each episode, from Missouri's commitment to attack on the strong Sumter, forms an intricate fabric of actions and reactions. This interconnection is what makes the history of the American War so fascinating and complex. It is impossible to isolate a single event and understand it without considering what came before and what followed. And so, we begin to draw the first contours of this epic conflict. The initial situation of fragile equilibrium between free and slave states seemed stable, but only on the surface. By exploring the territorial expansion and the following commitments, the full picture begins to emerge. So what exactly was at stake in 1819? Well, this is a story that deserves to be told with care and attention to the details. In 1819, the United States lived a kind of delicate balance, a carefully adjusted balance with 11 free states and 11 slave states. This parity seemed at first glance the solution to maintain peace between conflicting northern and southern interests. But in fact, it was like walking over a razor wire, as any imbalance could trigger unbearable tensions. This apparent harmony, more political than practical, hid deep economic and cultural divisions. While the North thrived with an industrial economy, the South was supported by plantations that depended on slavery. This economic difference directly influenced perceptions about the future of the country. For many in the North, the expansion of slavery represented a moral and economic setback. Already in the South, where the slave system was the backbone of the agricultural economy, any threat to this way of life was seen as an existential affront. Imagine a room full of gunpowder where two people argue as they hold on. This was the climate between states at the time. This tension permeated each political discussion and government decision. The situation became even more complex with population growth and the desire for new territories. Congress was constantly pressured to maintain this precarious balance by deciding whether new states would be free or slaves. It was not just a matter of morality, but of political power. In the Senate, each state had 2 votes, which made vital parity so that neither party dominated national decisions. Thus, each time a new territory claimed the condition of state, it was like reopening wounds not yet healed. Interestingly, it is at this time that the manifest destiny, although still in its childhood as a concept, was already beginning to shape debates about territorial expansion. The idea that the U.S. had the divine right to expand until the Pacific fed the desire for growth, but also brought the inevitable question, Will the new territory allow slavery? This is where politics and war strategies begin to converge, as the control of these territories also meant control over resources and commercial routes. Meanwhile, the international scenario also had its influence. Revolutions in Latin America and European conflicts served as a backdrop, reminding Americans that their young nation was still vulnerable in a world of colonial powers. This international context helped maintain internal tension, as if the U.S. were a stretched rope, vibrating between the northern and southern forces. But all this was just the beginning. The real battles were yet to come. Territorial expansion promised to intensify conflicts by placing this fragile balance in check. What would come next? The idea of territorial expansion in the United States in the early 19th century was not just a geographical ambition, it was an almost religious belief. The Manifest Destination suggested that Americans had the right, or rather the obligation, to extend their domains to the Pacific Ocean. This concept, impregnated with a sense of divine mission, inflamed the imagination of the population and shaped government policies. For many, expansion was not only a territorial advance, but a reflection of the nation's moral and economic progress. However, this grand vision hid a problem. More territories meant more decisions about slavery. The impetus for the West was catalyzed by events such as the purchase of Louisiana in 1803, which practically doubled the size of the country. These new territories, such as Texas and New Mexico, were seen as gold opportunities for farmers, traders, and adventurers. Imagine a young farmer of the time, eager for fertile lands where he could plant and raise his family. This narrative of hope and prosperity was used to justify expansion, but rarely discussed how it fed the tension between free and slave states. Each new piece of land was a potential stage for new political disputes. The Manifest Destination also legitimized controversial practices, such as forced removal of indigenous populations. Whole tribes were moved to make their way to American settlers in a strategy that combined war, forced treaties, and politics. This often brutal approach was presented as a necessary evil for the fulfillment of the national destination. However, the human and cultural consequences of this process still echo in American history. To understand the real impact, just think about the Tears Trails, an episode of suffering that bitterly contrasts with the idealistic view of expansion. From a strategic point of view, expansion was also a power move on the international scene. The more territory the U.S. controlled, the harder it would be for foreign powers, such as Spain or Britain, interfering with their affairs. Territories such as Texas, initially part of Mexico, became central pieces in this geopolitical chess game. The annexation of Texas in particular showed how war strategies and expansionist ambitions were intertwined, intensifying both internal and external tensions. However, each new step towards the West increased the pressure on the already delicate scale between North and South. Latitude 36°30, established by Missouri's commitment, was not enough to contain the differences. Increasingly, the destiny seemed less divine, and another succession of political and strategic choices. And as the territories were being occupied, the question about slavery or freedom became inescapable, planting the seeds to the commitments and conflicts that were coming. Between 1820 and 1850, a series of events and commitments shaped the path to the American Civil War, reflecting the incessant struggle for balance between free and slave states. Missouri's commitment in 1820 was an initial milestone in this process. The addition of Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state seemed to be the ideal solution to maintain balanced political scale. In addition, latitude 36°30 was established as a limit for the expansion of slavery to the west. This line, although simple on paper, became a symbol of the division that deepened between North and South. Over time, territorial expansion brought new challenges. The annexation of Texas in 1845 generated tensions with Mexico, culminating in the Mexican-American War, 1846-1848. This war was not just a military conflict, it was also a strategic step to ensure vast western territories, such as California and New Mexico, under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. These new territories rekindled debates about slavery, as control of these lands also meant political control of the future of the U.S. It was as if every territorial victory brought with it a new political battle. 1850's commitment again sought to relieve tensions. California was admitted as a free state, but with the peculiar requirement to send a pro-slavery senator, a solution that pleased anyone. Popular sovereignty was introduced, allowing residents of the new territories to decide on slavery. This concept, although it seems democratic, in practice only extended the conflict. It was like giving a partial referee the power to decide a game. The chances of consensus were practically null. A often forgotten point is how these commitments shaped the behavior of ordinary people. Imagine a farmer in Kansas trying to decide whether his land would be free or slave. Not only did he face ethical dilemmas, but he also feared for his family's safety, as armed conflicts often burst into. These local disputes showed that political commitments were insufficient to contain violence and discord in everyday life. These events were not just isolated chapters, but links from a current that grew in tension. Each commitment seemed to momentarily alleviate the pressure, but actually created new rupture points. The next phase of this narrative would bring even more fierce conflicts, revealing that the fragile balance could not be kept indefinitely. The climb was just starting. The 1850s marked a climb of tensions that seemed increasingly irreconcilable. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Law was a watershed, requiring free states to return fugitive slaves to their owners. This measure generated revolt in the North, where many saw this imposition as a moral and legal affront. Abolitionist groups such as the movement led by Harriet Tubman and the Escape Network intensified their efforts, directly challenging the law. Imagine the courage of an ordinary person hiding a fugitive in his home, knowing that he could face severe penalties. This act of resistance became a symbol of the struggle against the slave system. As the tension spread, the Kansas became a literal and symbolic battlefield. Bleeding Kansas, as it became known, was the scene of violent clashes between abolitionists and pro-slavery. Small villages were attacked, burned farms, and lives destroyed in the name of an ideal. Violence in this territory exposed the failure of popular sovereignty, which, far from bringing a solution, only deepened the division. The case of John Brown, who led armed attacks on Kansas, highlights how even individuals began to see violence as the only way out to resolve the issue of slavery. The climate of conflict was not restricted to battlefields. In Congress, the environment was equally inflamed. An emblematic example was the attack on Senator Charles Sumner, beaten with a cane by a pro-slavery colleague after a speech condemning the system. This incident shocked the country, showing that political divisions were becoming personal hostility. It was a foreshadowing that civilized debate was being replaced by brute force, and no one was immune to the impact of this growing polarization. Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case in 1857 was also a devastating blow to the hope of reconciliation. The court denied citizenship to African Americans and invalidated Dred Scott's efforts to obtain his freedom, basically stating that black, free, or enslaved people had no rights that whites were required to respect. This decision not only inflamed public opinion in the North, but also gave South a false sense of legal certainty. It was as if the conflict had been formally sanctioned by the highest authorities in the country. Each of these episodes widened the abyss between North and South. Frustration and revolt began to transcend political debates, rooting in people's daily life. The way to war seemed inevitable, and figures like John Brown and Abraham Lincoln were beginning to emerge as catalysts for a greater change. The 1850s came to an end with a climate of complete fragmentation, and the year 1859 brought one of the most striking events of this climb: John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry. Brown, a fervent abolitionist, led a bold attempt to incite a slave revolt, arming the enslaved to fight for his freedom. Although the endeavor failed, resulting in its capture and execution, the emotional impact was deep. To the North, Brown became a martyr of the abolitionist cause. To the South, a terrorist who personified the threats to his traditions. The tension came to this point that not even the words could appease the mood. Each side saw an existential threat on the other. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 was the final blow to the already fragile balance. Lincoln, although not abolitionist, was firmly against the expansion of slavery in the new territories, which made him a polarizing figure. His electoral victory without Southern support was seen as a sign that Northern interests would dominate the country's future. Imagine the psychological impact in the South. It was like watching the arrival of a leader who, in his perceptions, represented the end of his way of life. It was not long before South Carolina led the secession, followed by other states, forming the Confederated States of America. The formation of the Confederation was more than a political gesture. It was a potential statement of war. States such as Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi saw secession as their only option to preserve slavery and its agrarian economy. Meanwhile, in the North, the Union was seen as inviolable, and the idea of a divided country was inconceivable. There was also a clear strategic component. To the North, losing Southern states meant weakening their economic and military power. To the South, breaking North was an attempt to preserve its identity and independence. The attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861 marked the official beginning of the American Civil War. Confederate forces fired at the fort, controlled by the Union in Charleston, South Carolina, causing an immediate reaction. The American War had begun, but few had a sense of the destruction scale that was coming. That event was like a spark in a gunpowder barrel that had been filled with decades of political, moral, and economic disputes. As the conflict unfolded, war was not just a territorial or military struggle. It was a battle for ideals that would define the future of the United States. Each war strategy adopted, each battle fought, carried the weight of the divisions that had accumulated by generations. And so the nation embarked on a confrontation that would forever shape its identity, leaving lessons that still resonate in the present. Now that you know the events and strategies that shaped the American Civil War, ask yourself, how are these historical decisions reflected in the challenges we face today? Most importantly, what other lessons hidden in the history of American wars have you not yet explored? If you got this curiosity, you are in the right place. The American War Channel is full of content that goes beyond the surface, bringing strategic analyses and fascinating facts of other decisive moments of American history. So take the opportunity to apply now and activate notifications. Thus, you do not lose any video and continue to expand your knowledge about the greatest conflicts that shaped the world. Leave in the comments what surprised you most in this video, or what other theme you would like to see here. Let's continue this journey together.